Welcome to another episode of Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. We've got a great show today. We've got a lot of topics that we're going to discuss. President Donald Trump accused Barack Obama of treason. That seems significant, so we'll touch on it at least briefly. Then we'll talk about protests in Kiev and across Ukraine, really, against President Volodymyr Zelensky, who signed a law bringing anti corruption institutions under government control. That was the spark that set off these protests. Next, we'll discuss conservative fears that Trump will sign legislation granting amnesty to certain classes of illegal aliens. And finally, if we have time, we'll talk about some signs that American Christians, including high profile MAGA influencers, may be turning against Israel. So let's start with Trump accusing Obama of treason. The context for this accusation is that Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, issued a report last week which said the Obama administration had manipulated evidence pertaining to alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election. Trump usually frames that as they tried to steal the election, they tried to delegitimize him, it was all a hoax, it was a witch hunt. And now he's saying, and Tulsi Gabbard is saying, that Obama was the leader of this treasonous conspiracy to delegitimize Trump. A conspiracy that seems to have ramped up in their estimation after Trump actually won the election. So, Joseph, I'm going to kick it to you first. How big a deal is all this? And do you think it'll actually go anywhere as far as indictments of senior officials in the Obama administration?
Yeah, so if you so I was a bit surprised when this came out because, you know, during his first term and, during the beginning of Biden's term, Trump made a big deal over Russia Gate and the Russia hoax, but nobody had really seemed to pay attention to it for a while. So I was surprised to find that this would come up again. So I went through and I looked at the memo that was released by by Tulsi Gabbard and at DNI. And essentially, the accusation comes down to the argument of whether the government falsely asserted that Russians were interfering directly with voting machines or manipulating votes. So the the argument that DNI Gabbard makes is that the Obama administration asserted that Russians interfered with the American election while knowing from their own intelligence that the Russians had no way of hacking America's voting infrastructure or manipulating the actual vote counts of the 2016 election. Um, when people actually start to read the documents and things, I'm rather doubtful that this will make a major impact, simply because everybody who was present during the Russiagate uh, question knows that the major issue that was being made was whether the Russians were conducting media influence operations, not whether they were actually hacking voting machines and manipulating vote totals. The question of whether the CIA and the intelligence agencies were manipulatively used for political purposes is, I think, a very good and important question. And I wouldn't be surprised if that continues to be an issue in the future that the Trump administration chooses to pursue. But I'm very doubtful that this part, at least from what the evidence that has been released by Tulsi Gabbard, uh, has much substance to it, especially in the sense of being able to try somebody in a court of law, let alone convict them. I think, at most, you might be able to convict somebody of perjury, of lying to Congress, perhaps, but that's about the most that you could possibly get out of this. As for the timing, again, this came up rather suddenly after a long period where the Trump administration and Donald Trump had not mentioned Russiagate in any substantive measure. And so it really does seem like a bit of a suspicious attempt to deflect from the Epstein question by saying, oh, you know, people are concerned about this government conspiracy. Well, actually, there was a bigger government conspiracy against us. So that seems to be my read on the take. Um, I very much doubt that this would ever lead to something like Barack Obama being indicted, which I see some people on social media calling for, but in my opinion, that's simply delusional.
So yeah, you drew a distinction there between cyber attacks that directly affect the vote tally, and on the other hand, more general influence operations to sway public opinion. I'll note that there's another important distinction, maybe not quite as important, but still notable within that first category, which is cyber attacks on election infrastructure and cyber attacks, for example, to hack the Democratic Party emails and steal these materials and release them to WikiLeaks. And so that's a distinction worth keeping in mind when you're reading these accusations from the Trump administration. And I think that there are sometimes some confusion even on their part about what these documents, these intelligence documents from the Obama administration are claiming. um, I'll note also that Tulsi Gabbard declassified today, we're recording Wednesday afternoon, a House intelligence assessment from 2020 that was looking at these intelligence assessments from the Obama years. I think in particular a 2017 one, early 2017, before Trump was inaugurated, obviously. And that declassified document seems maybe a little more significant than the initial tranche of stuff released last week by Gabbard. And what it basically calls into question is the confidence projected by the intelligence community that Putin actually wanted for, he preferred Trump to win over Hillary Clinton, and he aspired to help him do so. And that's pretty significant if they're saying, well, there wasn't, by the standards of normal tradecraft of, intelligence, this wasn't up to snuff, basically. It also questioned the sourcing for the claim that Putin ordered the leak of those hacked emails. I found that formulation to be a little odd because it almost seems to imply that Russia did hack those emails and steal them from the Democratic Party. You remember a lot of this had to do with Hillary Clinton's campaign, and it revealed some documents that led to the whole Pizzagate thing and some embarrassing information about Hillary Clinton, giving speeches to big financial institutions saying politicians need a public and a private position, stuff like that. And also, it seemed to show some coordination, significant coordination between the media and the Clinton campaign, which seemed, you know, manifestly biased in her favor. So this new thing might be more significant, but I think I do share your general take that it doesn't seem like grounds for like indicting Barack Obama. And Tulsi Gabbard in her Sunday new Fox News interview, one of the Sunday shows, I think is called something Futures on Fox News. She gave the impression that she thinks that Obama officials, including perhaps Obama himself, should be indicted. She was asked specifically about that. She said that, well, she referred these documents to the DOJ, but that's up to like the DOJ and the FBI, not the Director of National Intelligence to decide how to go forward with that. So I think this is something to keep an eye on because the Trump administration is making some big claims about a treasonous conspiracy. I will note, Joseph, I don't know how old you were in 2016, early 2017. I'm sure you were a precocious young man who was paying attention to politics, but even you might not be aware, since you were so young at that time, that this really was a hoax in my estimation. The main thing was about so-called collusion between Russia and Trump to steal the White House, basically. It was nonsense. Um, and I see it as more of a media issue. Like, I think the way that the media responded to this and pounced on every claim and had all of these false positives about Russian collusion was really the main story. Whereas the Obama administration, to my recollection at least, wasn't being quite as, sensational in its framing of this. But we'll keep an eye on it. And yeah, I do think that, the clearest sign that this is some sort of deflection from Epstein is that Trump's major quote about this being treason came during a meeting with the president of the Philippines this week when he was asked about Epstein, and he used the occasion to say that's a witch hunt, but the witch hunt you should be focusing on is this Russia, Russia, Russia witch hunt. I don't know if he said that, but he always says Russia, Russia, Russia. And he just slid into the Russiagate thing. Um, And, it involves the intelligence community releasing documents, which, they can claim to be, oh, we actually do care about transparency and holding people accountable. So it probably is a diversion, but we can't be totally sure about that because, everything that Trump is doing is being interpreted as a diversion right now because people can't stop talking about Epstein. But I think we should move on from this. Let's get into Ukraine. There's actually a interesting segue here because the situation unfolding in Ukraine right now basically involves one of the things that involves is Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, saying that these anti corruption institutions are under Russian influence or we have to root out the Russian moles that are present in them. He seems to have learned from the Democrats or some rhetorical trick, perhaps. To my understanding, there's no evidence that these bodies actually are influenced by Russia, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Sumantra, can you kind of tell us what's happening in Ukraine, where Zelensky's facing this big protest movement, and what's the controversy all about, basically?
Right. So Zelensky is facing what is the largest protest movement. Of course, not in the scale of Maidan or even like 2014, but still relatively pretty big, and continuous protest movements in Kiev and some of the other big cities. It started yesterday, ostensibly about a new law that Zelensky and his parliament passed, taking power away from supposedly non-governmental and independent administrations, which was a check on the government. They were an anti-corruption organizations, which used to be funded partly by the European Union, partly by the United States, partly by the various other NGOs. Um, but essentially, it's a big deal for two reasons. One, it is the largest protest against Zelensky since the start of the war. And a lot of people are taking an opportunity of saying, by the way, Zelensky was essentially centralizing and consolidating his power as an authoritarian. But this is the first time we are seeing a protest happening against him. So it's the beginning of the end of Zelensky. More on that later. And the second thing that they are saying is this is the first time there is a protest happening the, the moment Zelensky targeted an agency which some kind of American funding tied up to it. I have to mention a couple of things. One, Zelensky has been on an authoritarian binge. It is just not noticeable in our countries because we have chosen a side, the side being that of Ukraine against Russia. He has been passing laws about conscription. He has been passing laws about who is going to go to war, what kind of laws there might be, what kind of cities the conscriptions will be targeted at, languages in various parts of Ukraine occupied parts where they used to speak Russia. So he has been passing laws, some with the help of Ukrainian parliament, some pretty unanimously saying that we need to sort this war out first before we can be like a full democratic government. The European Union and the United States so far turned a blind eye to Ukraine. But this is interesting because of two things that's happening now. The European Union, for the first time, mentioned that, by the way, if Zelensky continues to do that, he will jeopardize Ukraine's chance of joining the European Union. Now, some might say that there was never any chance. It was always a rhetorical, tool. But nevertheless, it's still a big intervention from the European Union, kind of like saying that, by the way, Zelensky might have reached its limit of toleration. The second is the Russians are actually starting a counter, invasion, a counter, launch of their counter. What is that thing called? A counter attack. Um, the Russians used to be in an attritional war with the Ukrainians for the time being, but they have changed their military tactic and they're about to surround some of the cities just at the same time when Zelensky is facing some kind of problem. And for anyone who has studied Ukrainian history, in all the previous iterations of anti-authoritarian protests that started in Ukraine, usually Ukrainian political system is designed in such a way that whenever the central person who is in power is facing some kind of problem, the others kind of like bandwagon against him. Uh, I don't know if that's going to be the same case this time, but given that the Russians are doing the counterattack, And given that the Ukrainian president is facing a two-pronged assault from one, his own people, and two, the European Union and the United States protesting, I think it's a precarious situation for Zelensky, like it hasn't been for at least the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I would add, not only are we seeing criticisms from the EU and from some of Ukraine's biggest, most vocal defenders, like people like former Ambassador Michael McFaul. I mean, he hasn't directly criticized Zelensky, but he did say Zelensky should not sign this bill into law, which is kind of silly because Zelensky pushed for this bill to be signed into law and pressured the parliament to pass it. That's my understanding, at least. We're also seeing just the Western media generally seemingly setting up Zelensky to kind of scapegoat him or something. Like, I was kind of shocked to see the headlines in, like, The Economist, for example, or the pictures of Zelensky that they're, putting at the top, because those pictures don't show him as the heroic, savior that he was depicted as being earlier in the war. He looks angry and authoritarian. So that'll be interesting to keep an eye on whether the Western press is just ready to throw him under the bus. Joseph, what do you want to add here?
Yeah, kind of building on that, I was very surprised to read the New York Times saying, "Oh, actually, there are a lot of people in Ukraine who are unhappy with Zelensky and feel that he's authoritarian and corrupt." That is not the kind of thing that you would have read in the New York Times 2 years ago. So I do think that that is noticeable movement. Um, the I suppose the major question is, how much room politically does Zelensky actually have to maneuver? His popularity ratings, from what we know, are down from, you know, significantly since the start of the war. But it still looks like he has majority support. And the protests were not particularly violent or confrontational. The police presence was low. There weren't any major clashes between government forces and protesters. Things to have, things seem to have been carried out smoothly. Um, so the question is whether this is the start of some kind of real popular resentment with Zelensky by people who feel like corruption has gone too far, this isn't sustainable, and the government needs to change, or whether it's just the kind of occasional dissatisfaction with governments that happens every so often by people who are like, well, the government is, it's a wartime government. Not everything is going to always go the way we want it. We want to express our displeasure, but, we don't actually want to topple Zelensky. So that is, I think, is the real question is if this is essentially a one-off or if this is the expression of some deeper current of discontent with the government within Ukrainian society. I don't think that is yet clear.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Sandra, to hear you answer that question, like whether you think this is the start of something that's going to kind of snowball. And kind of adding to that, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the representative from Georgia, MAGA representative, Congresswoman, she had a tweet on X, basically saying that these protesters were demonstrating against the war and against the continuation of the war and kind of blaming Zelensky for perpetuating it. I can't, that's a very rough paraphrase. That those weren't her words, but that was the general idea. Do you think that, and a lot of people were, objecting to her interpretation of the protest and saying, "No, I was there. This is about corruption." Do you think that there's any legitimacy, though, to that claim that this is kind of an indirect way of protesting against Zelensky in general, including his handling of the war? Is there a frustration there that's expressing itself right now?
I think that's a I think that's a little far fetched. I don't think. I mean, clearly the Ukrainians are frustrated with Zelensky. The Ukrainians are frustrated with the war, the way the war is conducted. There's a whole bunch of polling that you could see even a few months back that the Ukrainians were in support of at least some kind of a negative equilibrium or peace with the Russians. But overall, the problem in Ukraine is there is no one who is kind of like saintly or uncorrupted who would be able to take Zelensky's position. Like the other people, like Poroshenko or Timoshenko or whoever is, are the other Ukrainian politicians, they're all tainted because they have been in power and they were extremely corrupt. They are legacy parties of Ukraine and they are obviously kind of like, They will always be part of the power elite.
What
But
about Zelensky?
Zelensky was a good one, but he was sidelined by Zelensky, and I don't think Zelensky wants to take the reign of Ukraine in a time when they are clearly losing in the battlefield. So he could have been probably in the last couple of years a good, more realist, president, but I don't think he's in a position to do that now. That being said, the other thing, the dynamic of these movements is interesting because the moment there is even a little bit of protest against Zelensky, we have seen Zelensky double down on everything so far. That's his his traditional instinct is to crack down on any kind of protest or any kind of it spirals to a movement. Now, if Zelensky's position of power is harmed or threatened, there is a chance that Zelensky is going to double down on being more authoritarian. If that is coupled with massive, rapid Ukrainian setbacks in the battlefield, that would create a kind of situation which is similar to 2015, where the Ukrainians wanted to defeat the Russians in Debaltseve and then were routed, and then they had to do the Minsk II, settlement with the Russians. The Russians are clearly anticipating some kind of breakdown in Ukrainian resolve. There are over 700,000 Russian troops currently in Ukraine. There are two different axes of at least 150,000 Russian troops ready to start two different axes to move towards, some of the Ukrainian front lines. And just like in any attritional war, it goes on for a long time and then it suddenly collapses. And if that is something that, if it happens with the Ukrainian troops, we might either see the Europeans say, like, it doesn't matter whether Zelensky is corrupt, we are just going to support him because the Russians are going to take over Kiev, or, there's a total rout of Ukrainian troops and there is an internal political process in Ukraine where all the people who are opposed to Zelensky but who are dormant so far would come into the forefront and take advantage of the chaos. I don't know what's going to happen. I also do think the Russians are overestimating just how much the front line is going to collapse. If you see the macro level map of the last 4 years, yes, they were moving here and there, but overall the map hasn't changed much. Now, again, that might completely change tomorrow or in the next couple of months. But Zelensky might double down. The chances of an anti-Zelensky rapid and long protest is there. Whether that is going to happen is something that depends on whether the Ukrainian army is actually losing in the battlefield.
Yeah, I kind of want to highlight the interesting context in which this controversy has arrived because Trump has recently had an apparent change of heart about Ukraine and wants to figure out a way to get them more weapons. I mean, he is saying he wants to do that in a way that the US taxpayer doesn't have to pay for it. We'll give the weapons to the EU countries in NATO, or some of them at least, and then they will ship weapons to Ukraine, and then at some point they'll pay the US for those weapons. Um, so maybe it's not that big of a deal, but it does raise these concerns that Western financial and military support is being wasted by a corrupt Zelensky administration, right? And these anti-corruption institutions were looking at Zelensky's government, right? It's not like they weren't finding anything and that they were irrelevant. He's cracking down on them at a time where it seemed like they were zeroing in on actual corruption cases having to do with some of his ministers, and that's one thing that's so suspicious right now. The other context is Russia and Ukraine are restarting their Istanbul talks, or at least talks in Turkey. I think they're in Ankara, actually. I could be mistaken, but I think those are supposed to be taking place today. This news kind
Today.
of came out of nowhere for me. And then Russian media was apparently reporting that they had dispatched a delegation to Turkey for talks. That just a couple of days ago is when I first caught wind of it. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. I don't know. But those talks are happening today. And one thing that it seems like Putin probably still wants or wanted at one point and would like to get it if possible is the ouster of Zelensky. He hates Zelensky. Um, and he could frame that as a denazification. It doesn't really make sense to a Western audience because Zelensky is Jewish, but he could frame that as a win for the Russian people. The last thing that I'll say on this is one reason that this is so dangerous for Zelensky is he ran on an anti-corruption platform. Like, that's why they elected him. The other thing he ran on was that he was a pro-peace candidate who was going to avoid a war with Russia. Those are like the two main things, and also just this general feeling that he was an outsider because he was like a comedian. He wasn't part of the political establishment, so you could trust him to not, you could trust him to drain the swamp, basically. And that's not what he's doing now. But of the authoritarian things that Zelensky has done since the war began, I don't rank this at the highest level. I mean, it was in 2022 that he imposed regulations on the media and curbed what journalists could say and basically consolidated the media into this kind of Ukrainian state entity, as I understand. He's exerted extreme control over the media. And, that makes sense. Trump called him a dictator. That's another interesting contextual detail in the background. And because the Western media objected so vociferously to that description of Zelensky, and now they're kind of going along with it. You know, what I would say is in a war, you kind of need a dictator. This is like an honorable Western institution going back to Rome. Like during a war, you need a strong, active executive. You don't have time for bickering in parliament. But I would also say that that's one reason that wars are bad and should be avoided if at all possible through diplomacy and should be ended quickly when victory seems impossible or when the war is just not worth it anymore, because it is bad for the Ukrainian people. This growing authoritarianism, Ukraine has a history of significant corruption, and this makes it less likely that they will move beyond that. Joseph, you want to add anything before we move on to immigration?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as far as the reason that protests have erupted over this, as opposed to something like us exerting control over the media, is I think that the issue of corruption is particularly sensitive to Ukrainians. You know, the control over the media, regulation of political parties, these are all things that can have pragmatic roots in the needs of a wartime society. Um, to maintain stability for the war effort and so on and so forth. Um, those are all things that people can justify to themselves, and they don't have an immediate impact on people's everyday well-being. But corruption is something that Ukrainians have suffered with very viscerally for many years. It's something that is a major problem in the country, and it's extremely frustrating to the people who have to deal with it, who are aware that these oligarchs are essentially fattening themselves off of the public purse. Ukrainians personally are have to pay for this either in, lost tax revenue or bribes or being frustrated because oligarchs can come in and take what is rightfully theirs, other kinds of social and economic privileges. Um, and so when Zelensky seems to be enabling this, at a time when the Ukrainian people personally have to make great sacrifices, both in their own personal economic well-being, but also, their families and friends are dying on the battlefield. This really touches a nerve. And there have been various interviews with Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines who felt very strongly about this as well. Like, we're defending Ukraine so that oligarchs can plunder it. Like, is that what this is all about? And so in that case, I think it's reasonable to uh, that this would end up being the major flashpoint for social unrest in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Corruption is different from controlling the media in that respect. They both relate to authoritarianism in a way, but controlling the media has a wartime justification and it boosts morale through the manipulation of information. Whereas corruption does the opposite. It's demoralizing and it diverts needed resources to people who are genuinely corrupt. In the West, we use the word corruption pretty loosely. What we're talking about in Ukraine is actual corruption, like people getting money and taking bribes and stuff like that. So I think that's a very good point. Joseph, you had wanted to talk about immigration and specifically growing worries that the Trump administration is going to grant amnesty to workers in certain industries and sectors. So, what's gotten you and other immigration restrictionists so worried?
Sure. So one of the major issues that the Trump administration is attempting to deal with right now is, of course, the question of immigration and illegal immigration. Congress recently passed the One Big Beautiful Bill, and so we have a massively funded border security forces for ICE and for um, the Border Patrol. So the question is now, how is this going to be conducted? And the administration seems to have come under a lot of pressure from pro-business groups, especially farmers that are heavily reliant on illegal immigrants for their labor forces. And so Trump, at various times since about April, has began throwing out various sort of softballs about potentially relaxing deportations for certain classes of illegal immigrant workers. So he's talked about how the hospitality industry and farmers need these, so perhaps there's some way to find an arrangement that would provide. He's talked about potentially allowing farmers to vet illegal immigrants that have been working for them for a long time. He says, they know their people, they know their workers, they've been responsible. And he's suggested this at various times, and it has consistently made the base mad when these things come out, and so you see a pattern where Trump will suggest, "Oh, well, let's take illegal immigration. Let's relax deportations for this particular class of workers." The base gets angry about it. The Trump administration comes out and makes a statement. We're not going to do any amnesty. We're going to deport all illegal aliens in time, and then a week later, the same thing happens over and over again. Um, and so the fact that this is a pattern is, of course, concerning. Then you have this new bill, the Dignity Act, that's being sponsored, that was written by Maria Salazar, a representative from Florida, that essentially
Republican.
proffers the same sort of amnesty bill where illegal immigrants will have the ability to uh, essentially apply for a path that would allow them, not a path to citizenship per se, but a path to allow them to stay in the United States and to continue to work and avoid deportation. Now, the argument, and of course, the argument is that this will allow a more dignified sort of path for illegal immigrants. It will allow them to integrate themselves productively into society and avoid disrupting the labor force, and all the other same arguments that we've already heard before whenever the question of amnesty comes up. The Trump administration has said that they're not necessarily going to support this bill, but the fact that, at the very moment that the Congress has passed this big new border enforcement budget, and that Trump has consistently suggested that there are arrangements that we can make to avoid deportations for certain classes of workers. This seems to be a major problem. Republicans seem to be losing their nerve, and the Trump administration, with its deportation so far, has not been particularly impressive, at least as far as the numbers of immigrants that are actually being deported by border enforcement. Um, so this is a big issue as far as I'm concerned.
What do you think, Sumantra? Are you also concerned? Do you think it's a big issue? And how do you think the politics of this plays out?
I think the politics of this, as we have discussed, immigration is, of course, one of the top three issues of this country. Like, that is why people voted for Trump. I totally agree. Um, I think most of the stuff that has been done so far has been performative, and not competent. There could have been a lot more competent ways of doing, genuinely, a lot more competent ways of doing a lot of more deportation that the Trump administration actually promised, and to stop future pipelines from, coming to this country. We have talked before about the H-1B visa. That's an easy thing to do. You can just stop the H-1B visa, especially after seeing that how H-1B visa is essentially like mining scams, scam factories of getting people in jobs that absolutely shouldn't go to foreigners. You're having like interns levels of money and salary going to people to come, whereas you're actually losing jobs, which Americans used to do. Microsoft, for example, uh, got rid of 7,000 people or something, and then immediately increased its H-1B quota. I think those are the kind of things that the Trump administration can absolutely do tomorrow and stop, this uh, complete scam that happens. The second thing we have talked about is how we should tax the outward remittances. That could have been, a lot more, a lot less performative than sending ice to factories, but a lot more effective in actually deterring people from coming to this country for jobs. If they cannot send their money back to their country, then why on earth are they going to try and come and settle down here anyway? They can actually fine a lot of companies which are employing foreigners, for example. Some of the things that the Europeans, for example, are trying to do recently is to target those industries and those farms which benefit from illegal migration, instead of actually trying to target the people who are poor who are coming to this country. You try and target the people who are actually rich and who are employing those poor people to come and work. That's an easy way to do. I think. Uh, I think the problem with the Trump administration so far, and I hesitate to be too critical because it is only 6 months so far, and there is a lot more left. But I think the problem with the Trump administration is, one, it really wants to do stuff that is very eye catchy for its base, but it hasn't really thought through on how to have the maximum effective way of achieving its goals. The second point, which I think is a huge problem for the Trump administration, especially when it comes to immigration, is the rhetoric and the actual politics don't match. If you say to the people that, look, there are these segments which would require foreign migrants, and that is a valid statement to make. If someone comes and tells me tomorrow that, by the way, there is this entire segment of jobs in this country which Americans will not do, partly because they don't want to do manual labor, or they do not want to work at a salary which would make it competitive. Fair enough. I don't agree with that statement, but it is a logical statement to make. If that is the case, the logical way to deal with it is how Australia deals with it. It has a season for foreigners like from people from Fiji and Vanuatu to come work in the farms and then go back. You can have a logical way where you can say that there are some jobs which would be reliant on foreign labor, and then you can deal with that in a more rational way. But the Trump administration talked a big game about, like, we are going to deport 20 million people, 50 million people. First of all, I never believed in those numbers. So I'm not the one who's feeling betrayed now. But, like, because that is like, deporting 50 million people is a logistical task that is near impossible unless you're an actually fascistic country. It is not possible. If you believe that before elections, then you're a fool. I never believed that. But that being said, it did say that there are a lot of ways that it could actually do a lot of deportations that could have been done. None of those things are done so far. Like, what frustrates me, for example, is the actual things that could be done. H1B to me is a cause which is deep. It is creating a level of resentment that is not healthy for this country. It shouldn't be there. It is an actual scam. There are documented evidence of H1B visas being used for scam jobs. You can cut down on those things tomorrow if you want to. The fact that you're not doing it is, it can only mean two things. One, you're either incompetent, or two, you didn't mean what you said when you came with the elections. It has to be either one of those two ways, and neither of those two things are good for the Trump administration.
Yeah. There's been a debate. Republicans for a long time have talked a big game about illegal immigration and sealing the border and border enforcement and so forth. And there's always been a a big mismatch between the political rhetoric and what's actually been accomplished. Um, and there was always the question, well, is this because of pressure from the business community, which doesn't like losing their cheap labor, or is this because Republicans don't want to offend, especially Hispanic Americans who and potentially lose their votes. Deportations right now are popular even among Hispanic Americans, and that was, in fact, their support, increased support, was one of the reasons that Trump was elected to the second term. So the fact that this continues to be a problem, and especially the language and the kinds of carve outs that the administration and President Trump are attempting to make, seem to be a pretty good proof that the real issue that's stopping immigration enforcement is big pressure from donors and the business interests that really would not like to see their cheap labor force deported and be forced to pay American workers American wages for this. And now, of course, like you said, there's always the possibility that that's not necessarily feasible, but there are much more reasonable ways than by the granting of amnesty in one name or another that just acts as further incentive for additional illegal immigration in the future, because that's always what happens. You get these border enforcement amnesty deals like you saw under Reagan, the amnesty goes through and the border enforcement never actually follows up. And so it just acts as further encouragement for illegal migrants to come again in the future.
Joseph, you stole my idea. I was just about to say that, and I mentioned that in the meeting. Yeah, this is there's this expression associated. Some conservatives have used it. Democrats want cheap votes, and Republicans want cheap labor, and that explains why we always have more and more immigration. And I think that the Republican half of that has been vindicated by, what we've seen with the Trump administration getting a little squishy on the amnesty issue. And we should say they don't call it amnesty. They're emphatically denying that this is amnesty. But in any case, this perceived squishiness, it's not because they are trying minority outreach. Like during the convention, the RNC, that they passed out mass deportations now signs. Like they obviously the Trump administration, the whole Trump team doesn't have the same concerns about minority outreach. This is clearly driven by business interests. And not just farmers, not just the businesses in the specific sectors that Trump is thinking of giving some sort of carve out to, but just more broadly, like trade, investors worry about the stock market, stuff like that. There's probably kind of a wide business pressure on this particular issue. There's also, the Trump administration has all sorts of connections to Silicon Valley, and that's relevant to the H-1B issue. I do want to give Trump some credit. Like he closed the border, and he closed the border in a more quickly than anybody expected. Even like liberal mainstream media will go to the border and say, "Wow, there's like nobody crossing anymore. This is crazy. It looked totally different under Biden." So that's a significant thing. Um, I do think that there's a danger now. Trump is apparently already underwater on even on immigration now, where for the first like 4 months, even when Trump was losing support on his handling of the economy, etc., people were broadly supportive of him on the issue of immigration. I think CNN shows that he's -5 now, and they were showing he was way up on immigration earlier. So I don't think it's like they're lying or something or the polls are biased. I think it's always difficult reading these polls because some people don't like what Trump's doing on immigration because he's not going hard enough, and others think he's going too hard, right? Um, and I think we can infer that going underwater has to do with Republicans who are who are lowering their support for him because they're worried he's getting squishy. Because the liberals were already worried because of these like splashy deportations that the Trump administration was pursuing, like putting these alleged Trinidad, is that how you pronounce it? Gang members on planes and like sending them to this dungeon in El Salvador. Um, or these targetings of pro-Israel protesters and stuff like that. That stuff had already agitated the left. Now I think Trump risks losing his base, as you were mentioning earlier, Joseph, and that's concerning. I'll say this Dignity Act, and again, Maria Salazar, Republican representative, she's also saying this is an amnesty. I don't support amnesty. This is dignity. That's why it's called that. Some of it's not so bad. Like the first, I'm looking at these provisions of the Dignity Act that I found on her website. The first one is border security. Okay, don't fall for that. Reagan traded amnesty for border security, and he only got amnesty, not border security. So we're not going to follow that. But the next one is mandatory e-verify. That's a great idea. We should have done that yesterday. Why the heck don't we do that? We have the infrastructure. Okay, some people don't think it works as well as advertised. It's worked in Florida, to my understanding. Like, why not do it? What's the downside? That absolutely should be
It
done.
works as long as you enforce identity theft provisions.
Okay, then they should enforce that. Like they should find a way to make it work. That's what governance is. And that would allow I don't have any animosity, personal animosity towards Hispanic people, but like when I go to the park next to my house, I hear only Spanish, and I imagine that this part of Maryland was not like that 10 years ago. So there is like a perceptible difference in the demographics and the experience of being in America that that's making a lot of Americans uncomfortable and nervous, right? Clearly, and mandatory e-verify stuff like that. Those are like humane ways to address the issue to slow the velocity of social change, but without needing to put people in handcuffs on a plane to El Salvador. So I like stuff like that. I'm not saying we should support this act. It's clearly, I'm willing to use the word amnesty to describe what Salazar has in mind, even if she is, and I don't support amnesty. But there seems to be some things in there that maybe Trump could work with. If he is indeed going to make these carve outs, maybe he should do these extra things like e-verify, and remittances should be added to that thing if it passed. Republicans should make sure to add more taxes on remittances with no exceptions for home country. I don't know if we have time to get into the Israel issue. I'll shamelessly plug my piece I wrote today. Is Israel losing American Christians? I was just interested. There was this attack on the only Catholic church in Gaza. There were in this town called Taipei in the West Bank, which is a predominantly but not exclusively Christian Palestinian community. Settlers have been escalating their raids. They've been starting fires. One fire, which Palestinians say the Israeli settlers started, got close to this historic church, and they say imperiled it. And a lot of American Christians are watching these things and watching just the general suffering happening in Gaza, where now we're seeing like famine conditions. And they're starting to turn on Israel in a very public way. And I'm thinking of Michael Knowles. Matt Gaetz has also been extremely critical. And even our ambassador to Israel, who often seems like Israel's ambassador to the world, Mike Huckabee, had some critical things to say, although he's kind of walked back those criticisms a little bit since. Let's go to our picks of the week, where we each highlight an article from the American Conservative over the last 7 days or so. Sumantra, what's your pick of the week?
Yes, I will take After Iran Will Egypt Be Next by Shadi El Ghazali Harb. I am probably butchering the name. I apologize for that. But the basic thrust is similar to what you wrote, Andrew. Israel is acting in a very strange way. And the thrust of the essay is like, after Iran and after all the Israeli conflicts with Yemen and Gaza and Lebanon and Hezbollah and all that, will Egypt be the one facing an Israeli wrath? I don't personally think so. I think it's going to be Turkey, but it's an interesting essay for everyone to read.
Joseph?
Sure. Uh, we were talking about deportations, immigration, and amnesty, so I will pick Will Trump Grant Amnesty by Patrick Casey. It's a good piece. Highly recommend it. Take a read.
And I will pick What Did You Think the New Right Was by Jude Russo. More theoretical piece than Jude usually writes. He's our managing editor here at TAC. And he kind of gets into what he takes to be the coherence of the new right ideology, which has come under criticism recently. So he responds to one of those criticisms. He kind of talks about the history of the new right, what it consists of, immigration restriction, stuff like that, protecting the American worker, etc. And egalitarianism. He kind of throws that out there, which I thought was interesting and provocative and thoughtful. So people should go take a read. That brings us to the end of our latest episode. I want to thank people listening on podcast apps and remind them you can watch video versions of these episodes on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you. Leave a comment. Let us know how well we did. If you have negative things to say, don't worry about leaving a comment. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and thank you for listening. And I'll thank you, Sumantra, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.